want a man for president who's seasoned through and through, but not so doggone seasoned that he won't try something new. A man who's old enough to know
and young enough to do.
Well, it's up to you, it's up to you. It's strictly up to you. But it's Kennedy, 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 Kennedy.
Hi, I'm Haven, and this is Crash Course United States History. Today we'll be discussing John F. Kennedy. Kennedy was born in 1917 in Massachusetts to a wealthy Irish Catholic family, and after graduating from Harvard, he decided that he wanted to join the United States Navy, where he commanded a ship in the South Pacific. 3 years after leaving his position in the Navy, he decided that he wanted to be a member of the House of Representatives. He later left that job, finding it particularly dull, and ran for Senator of Massachusetts. He was elected as Senator in 1952, and after serving as Senator for 8 years, he decided that he wanted a more national role in politics. This is when he decided that he would run for president. He ran and was elected as president at age 43 in 1960. He was the youngest man to ever be elected the president, and this was actually a position that he utilized in his campaign advertisements, affirming that he was old enough to know, but young enough to do. Kennedy was young, experienced, and collected, and this led to his adoration and overwhelming remembrance today. Pat Schroeder, former United States House Representative, claimed that Kennedy really kept his head when all about him were losing theirs. Despite Kennedy's work in civil rights and domestic reform, he was more so remembered by his cool and collected personality. This was shown through his participation in the first televised debate. Now moving on to JFK's domestic agenda. JFK's idealistic plan for the United States called the New Frontier was aimed at social and economic reform and promoting democratic society over communism. Democrats only had a slim majority in Congress at the time, so there was some difficulty passing legislation, although he did cut taxes and work on issues such as unemployment, public housing, transportation, and Social Security. Kennedy's domestic agenda was largely consumed by civil rights. After his narrow election in 1960, President Kennedy wanted to ensure he had the African American support and also Southern support so he could pass legislation. Keeping this in mind, he appointed Thurgood Marshall as the first black member of the Supreme Court, spoke out against segregation in schools and public transportation, worked on equal employment, and publicly spoke with African American leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. In 1961, freedom rides picked up, demanding integration of public interstate transportation. Attorney General Robert Kennedy sent troops to protect the freedom riders. In 1962, student James Meredith was repeatedly denied admission to the University of Mississippi. JFK, Robert Kennedy, and the governor of Mississippi tried to work out a solution and failed. Meredith was finally escorted into class by federal troops mobilized by Kennedy. In 1963, a similar event occurred in Alabama. Governor George Wallace stood in the doorway of the United States of Alabama and refused to let 2 black students enter. Federal troops were yet again mobilized, and later that month, Kennedy addressed the severity of the racial issues in the country. He had seen too many racially motivated deaths and stated that the legislation guaranteeing equal rights to African Americans would be submitted to Congress. Arguably the most famous civil rights demonstration was the March on Washington in August of 1963. Over 200,000 people, all races, marched in D.C. celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. The civil rights legislation was doing well in Congress and slowly gaining momentum with Republicans. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was not passed before the death of Kennedy, but his predecessor, Lyndon Johnson, successfully passed the act. Now it's time for the mystery document. Let's see what we got. Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put up a wall to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us. I want to say on behalf of my countrymen who live many miles away on the other side of the Atlantic, who are far distant from you, that they take the greatest pride that they have been able to share with you, even from a distance, the story of the last 18 years. I know of no town, no city that has been besieged for 18 years that still lives with the vitality and the force and the hope and the determination of the city of West Berlin. While the wall is the most obvious and vivid demonstration of the failures of the communist system for all the world to see, we take no satisfaction in it, for it is, as your mayor has said, an offense, not only against history, but an offense against humanity, separating families, dividing husbands and wives and brothers and sisters, and dividing a people who wish to be joined together. It's John F. Kennedy.
We're going to finish today's segment with JFK's foreign policy. In his inaugural speech, Kennedy summed up his view on communism by saying the United States would pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and success of liberty. Several communist countries put this statement to the test during his term. Although Kennedy did increase the size of the U.S. military and resume nuclear testing, he was an opponent of war and of nuclear weapons. From the beginning of his campaign, he was avidly against communism and would do what it took to prevent it from spreading. Kennedy followed through with his promises and handled dangerous situations accordingly. In 1963, leaders of the US, UK, and Soviet Union came together and signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. It limited nuclear testing and was a step towards disarmament. Kennedy also urged Americans to drop stereotypes that were dividing communist and non-communist countries to make the world a safer place. When Diem was assassinated in 1963, his government fell with him. In 1961, just a few months after Kennedy was inaugurated, the Bay of Pigs invasion began. Kennedy inherited this plan from his predecessor Eisenhower and authorized the invasion in 1961. The Americans were training anti-communist Cuban exiles to fight the Cuban military with the support of Cuban revolutionaries that would hopefully join the exiles. The invasion ultimately failed and stained Kennedy's presidency. In 1962, an American spy plane took pictures of Soviet missile sites in Cuba. Kennedy wanted to keep this knowledge secret and decided with the help of his advisors to surround Cuba with a naval blockade. After 13 days of uncertainty, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles if the U.S. would stay out of Cuba. The Berlin Wall was also a critical issue during Kennedy's presidency. Before the construction of the wall, JFK and Khrushchev met in Austria. Khrushchev made threats to cut off East Berlin from Allied access. As a result, tensions increased and Kennedy spoke to the U.S. public and said that military force may be necessary to protect Berlin and contain communism. He expanded U.S. military power accordingly. After the construction of the wall, Kennedy resumed nuclear testing with some hesitation, further adding to the tensions of the Cold War. JFK visited Berlin in 1963 and was met by huge numbers of supportive Germans. There he gave a very famous speech. The Vietnam War, which started during Eisenhower's term, was an attempt by Americans to prevent South Vietnam from falling to communism. When Kennedy inherited the war, the Catholic and anti-communist Diem was in charge of South Vietnam. North Vietnamese forces were winning, and recognizing the instability of the war, Kennedy sent in U.S. military advisors and aid. He encouraged Diem to make a change to the government so it wouldn't collapse. In 1963, Kennedy spoke out about Vietnam in an interview. In contrast to the strained relationships between the U.S. and communist countries in the 60s, the relationship with Latin America seemed to improve with the Alliance for Progress. Kennedy wanted to loan $20 billion to Latin American countries for social reform. The program was not as successful as JFK had hoped.
In the end, Kennedy left an unmistakable legacy, and it leaves us to wonder, what would have been achieved if he'd lived? Alright guys, that's all for this episode of Crash Course United States History, and I'd like to thank these people for helping me out.